I would like to give a special shout out to Keith Bradner, the guy on the chair back there. Don't you know you're not supposed to climb up on a folding chair?
Nobody was looking at me.
Did you never read Officer Buckle? Anyway, Keith donates his time to help us with our technology. He came in yesterday and helped us set it up, and he's here today in case anything goes wrong. And then a very special thank you to Lucy Malenke, who is here tonight. She kind of spearheaded this whole thing, and she has donated all of her time, all of her preparation, hours she spent, and donating her time tonight to be with us. And so without further ado, I'm going to turn the mic over to Lucy.
Thanks, Holly, and thank you all for being here. I'm excited and a little bit nervous to see this room so full of people. As Holly mentioned, my name is Lucy Bryan Malenke. I'm a writer. I'm a visiting faculty member at Denison University. I'm a Coshocton County resident, and I am one of the co-founders of Coshoctonians for Peace and Equality, which is a local nonpartisan grassroots racial justice organization. I'm here today to talk to you about Coshocton's Black history. And I have with me Holli Rainwater, who is the program coordinator here at the museum, and I also have Abigail Callis, who is the archivist here at the museum, contributing to this program today. So recently I told a friend that I was going to be giving a presentation on Black history at the museum, and she sort of cocked her head and gave me this quizzical look, like, what does Coshocton's Black history have to do with you, a white lady? And I think that was a very telling reaction, because it says something about the way that some, probably most, white folks think about history. We tend to erase whiteness from the equation when we think about history involving white people. So Susan B. Anthony, Abraham Lincoln, Thomas Edison, Elvis Presley. They're just part of American history, everybody's history. But when we talk about Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, Martin Luther King Jr., Billie Holiday, Muhammad Ali, suddenly we're talking about Black history. Now, I'm not saying that we should scrub any mention of race from our discussions of history. George Washington's whiteness and Rosa Parks' blackness are both essential aspects of who they were and how their lives shaped our collective history. But I do want to point out that our tendency to overlook whiteness or to use it as the default tells us something about who has written and who has shaped the stories that we call our history. In the introduction to his book, An African American and Latinx History of the United States, historian Paul Ortiz describes an interaction that he had with one of his students at UC Santa Cruz. And that student explained, as a student of African heritage growing up in Santa Cruz, a predominantly Caucasian town, the role my ancestors played in the development of the country was never revealed. Slavery was always downplayed in favor of glorifying Abraham Lincoln and the Emancipation Proclamation. How was I to regard my heritage with confidence while the environment I was raised in depicted Africans as nothing but slaves saved by a white man? Believe me, no teacher ever let me forget that. The stories we choose to preserve and those that we let vanish into the recesses of history can tell us a lot about ourselves. I'm proud to stand up here tonight to help share the incredible lives and stories of some Black people who have called Coshocton their home. Their stories matter to me because they have shaped this place. And their Blackness matters to me because it played a critical role in how they experienced the world around them, including Coshocton. I also want to acknowledge that some skepticism about 3 white women standing up to share Black stories might be warranted. White historians and artists and storytellers, by and large, have not been good stewards of Black, Brown, and Native American histories. They have overlooked and neglected important stories. They've willfully erased stories in which white people are the villains. And they have used the stories of people and communities of color in service of stereotypes and problematic narratives. For example, the white savior narrative that Paul Ortiz's student received about Abraham Lincoln. Consider the fact that this museum is located on White Woman Street, named for Mary Harris, a white woman living among Mohawk Native Americans who temporarily settled in this area in the mid-1700s. Why is her story the one we choose to tell? What histories of her Mohawk community were lost because they were not white histories? But history need not repeat itself. Abby and Holly and I are all committed to forging a path that honors the incredible stories of Coshocton's Black residents. As Diana Ramey Berry and Kelly Nicole Gross point out in their book, A Black Women's History of the United States, to share Black history is to chart a course where the incredible, the fantastic, and the triumphant meet, mix, and mingle, often simultaneously, with hardship and terror. The stories you hear tonight will reflect that truth. I hope you enjoy and feel challenged and inspired by this journey through history, which gives a very abbreviated glimpse into the ways that Black Coshoctonians for more than 2 centuries have been overcoming tremendous obstacles to live joyful, creative, industrious, community-minded lives. And with that, I will hand the mic over to Abby.
Is this a good volume, everybody? Good. All right. My name is Abigail. I work here at the museum in the archives. I've spent the past 2 years going through our stacks and looking at our documents, digitizing, transcribing, and researching them. And that's what brought me to my talk, which is going to be on Pryor Foster and Letty Thomas. We're going to be talking about Coshocton's early years, 1820s to 1860s, and how both of them were an important part of that history. And we start with Pryor Foster. Pryor Foster was born in 1799. How he ended up in Coshocton County is still unknown. His father lived in Stark County for many years. He died in 1840. He never ventured to Coshocton, but Pryor Foster did. One of the theories is that he came for an education. His brother's biography notes that it was really important to their father that they all received higher education. And Pryor Foster did just that in Coshocton. He received an education through Adam Johnston, who was Coshocton's first clerk of courts. He was the son-in-law to Charlie Williams, if you guys are familiar with Coshocton's first white settler. And Adam Johnson gave both Pryor Foster and a young white boy by the name of Joseph Burns a solicitor's education. And he gave it to them in the building that was once known as King Charlie's Tavern, but most likely at the time was actually Coshocton's first courthouse. During this time, I think it's important to mention that Ohio had black laws. We had 1802 and then revisions in 1804 and 1807, which tacked on new creative ways to make it almost impossible for Black people to become citizens or to own land in Ohio. It was not illegal for a Black person to become a citizen of Ohio. It was not illegal for them to own land or to start a business. But these laws were set in place to make it almost impossible for them to achieve those goals. And so these are just a couple of them. Proof of freedom. They had to prove when coming to Ohio that they were already free. Not everybody had their paperwork, and not everybody was free. $500 bond requirement. This was more of a promissory bond. They had to have 2 white people in that area vouch for them and basically say that if this Black person does anything wrong, that they will pay a $500 bond, which is equal to $18,000 by today's standard, which is a very big ask. And if they got through those and a couple other requirements, they could not testify against whites. So if the people of that town didn't want them there, they didn't want them as neighbors, they didn't want them as business owners, Black people settling in the area could not advocate for themselves, they could not fight for their rights, and most likely they would immediately lose if a white person suggested that they did anything wrong. So while all of this is going on, Prior Foster had a ton of land. He was a respected citizen in Coshocton. And I've got a couple of examples here. In 1829, there was an auction at the courthouse for lot 159. It's that top star. And for $9, Foster showed up, he bid, he won, and he was granted that deed. And I think that that's extraordinary. There is nothing more public than an auction at the courthouse. And everybody attending knew who he was. It wasn't just on paper, there was no guesswork as to who it was who bought that land. He also had land down at the second star, and that is Second and Chestnut. And so he had at least 2 lots in town. But he also had almost 1,000 acres all over Coshocton, Muskingum, and Tuscarawas counties, most of it being in Coshocton. And I put as an example, he owned a 1/6 of the town lots in Newcastle, and he owned hundreds of acres in the outlots of Newcastle. Newcastle is known as a place on the Underground Railroad. There are multiple houses even today that are still known for having little hidey areas for runaway slaves to hide on their trip up to Canada. And so on the second piece of land down at the bottom there, that's this property. Now this building was built a couple years after Prior Foster had already scooted out of town, but he had a double shanty right here on Second and Chestnut area. And it's noted in Siebert's Beginnings of the Underground Railroad in Ohio that in his double shanty, he would hide runaway slaves. He would keep them there until it was safe at night to cross the river. It also goes on to note that in an emergency, they could be sent over a north branch at Hanging Rock. And so if we look at those same points on 2025 Coshocton's GIS map, you might notice that we have bridges there. The dotted line there was actually where the railroad, the trestle bridge was. Chestnut Street was the original and still now is a crossing point to get over into Roscoe. And so him having land in these 2 spots was very intentional and very advantageous for him as he helped people escape and cross the river. Another story from about 1839, and this one is from Reverend William E. Hunt's Historical Collections, talks about several fugitives. He puts it in quotations, which I love. It notes and speaks to his character that he did that, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. But several fugitives were stopped with him on their way to Canada. United States officers came and they were looking for them. And the people of Coshocton knew what Prior Foster had been up to, kind of gave him the runaround. They helped stall them, and they made it so that Prior Foster and the runaway slaves could escape out of the county safely. Whether they did it because they were sympathetic to his cause or because they just respected him as their neighbor, either way, they helped him. Unfortunately, they were ultimately recaptured and taken south. Prior Foster was not, but the runaway slaves were. And so during this time, again, just to look at where the laws were, Black laws still absolutely in effect. But they weren't enough. People weren't adhering to them. They weren't ratting out on their Black neighbors. They weren't, the courts weren't prosecuting people. And I think that Despite 1839 being a low point in Ohio's history for how many laws we had on the books to try to stop Black people from becoming citizens in the state, I think that that speaks to the environment in which most of the people in Ohio didn't follow the laws. And so they kept adding more and more laws. This one specifically starts punishing people for helping slaves. And so key points of it, if you gave a runaway slave some food as they were running through your yard, you could get a $500 fine, there's that $500 again, and jail time up to 60 days. And you also see fugitive, right? They weren't runaway slaves. They weren't people escaping chattel slavery. They were suddenly fugitives. And that kind of rewording set a precedence that people then, since they were scared, they didn't want to have this fine, they didn't want to go to jail, they started backing off on helping. Another thing is, if you were found transporting, like physically transporting slaves through the state of Ohio, you could receive 3 to 7 years of imprisonment for hard labor. So you yourself would turn into an indentured servant to the United States. So at this point, Prior Foster scooted out of Ohio, presumably because these laws started getting more and more strict. He moved up to Michigan. Michigan's laws were much more lax, much to the horror of most of the people of Michigan. And Prior Foster, receiving his education, knew about these laws and how to use them to his advantage. And what he did is he opened up the Woodstock Manual Labor Institute. And this was a school for Black children and then later on women and immigrants to come and have an education. And they could either pay with money or they could pay through manual labor. Prior Foster is quoted in his circular of Woodstock Manual Labor Institute as saying, African Americans in Michigan enjoy all the rights of the whites except that of suffrage, and I hope this will not be long denied. And so for him, I will go more into his life outside of Coshocton and Woodstock and Michigan and his children and his brothers in another talk that I'm going to be doing in the fall. And I'll move on to Letty Thomas. And Letty Thomas, just to give kind of a rundown for her, she was not born in Coshocton or in Ohio. She was born in Maryland in 1812, and she was a slave to Colonel William Simmons. He was the accountant for the War Department. Simmons kind of got pushed out of his job and decided that it was a good time to retire on the military land that he had acquired in service. And so he moved to Coshocton. In 1819, he brought Letty from Washington. She was 7 years old. In 1821, he was granted an indenture agreement for Letty. For those not familiar with indenture servitude agreements, it meant that you were legally a slave. The language behind these agreements still used slave and master in them. And so this was a loophole in Ohio and in many places where you could still have somebody as a slave for you for X amount of time, because instead of slavery, it was an indenture agreement. She was required to serve the Simmons household until she was 18. And so then we skip forward almost 30 years. And her and her 2 sons are working in a tavern. The tavern was owned by Mary Hay. She was a widow. And I think it's important to mention, I put as a little point there, that Mary would go on to marry Joseph Burns. And he was that little boy who got an education with Prior Foster. By 1854, Letty Thomas had built a tavern at 15th and Main Street that she owned. Like, it started out small, and then 2 years later, she upgraded. Another addition was built on, and here's a photo of it. And you can see it in its glory. They put the top floor on, and they popped out the addition there. This one's a little bit after she owned it, but it still would have looked exactly like that. Before they finished the walls on the downstairs, they had a huge 4th of July celebration in Letty Thomas's public house. And everybody knew that it was owned by a black woman and her 2 sons. That 4th of July celebration was held in 1857 and 1858. George Washington's birthday was also celebrated there. Masonic festivals were celebrated there. Elaborate dinners were there. And the people who put on and organized these events, I want to go here. We see big up front, president of the day was now Judge Joseph Burns. But we also see Humrickhouse. We see Johnson, 2 names that I love seeing. We've got Henry Howe, who wrote the historical collection for Ohio. He wrote the one for Coshocton and many other counties. You know, we've got Frew, Irving, we've got Presbyterian Reverend William E. Hunt, Workman, Hack, McLean. These names, these last names are still in our community and in this room. They're on our buildings on Main Street because these men owned and operated those businesses and were such notable people in the community. So, like outside of people locally supporting, it was right on the stop for the railroad tracks. It was called the Railroad and then later on the Arlington Public House because of that. And this was before railroads offered meals. And so people would get off and they'd have a meal and they would rest and they would, you know, bathe. And overall, her business boomed because of what she offered. In 1860, she is noted as the owner of the boarding house and has 7 white boarders. And some of it says too that her son owned it. He had a tavern within her public house that he ran, but she had the boarding house. After the 1860s, though, we start getting real close to the Civil War, right? And tensions are getting real weird. And unfortunately, the increase in railway travel meant an increase in white Southern travelers. They viewed Thomas's independence and prosperity as unnatural and threatening. And ultimately, Letty Thomas and her family were forced out of their own business by the patrons and the railroad company. Now, there is no documented examples of what Letty Thomas and her family went through that forced them out of their business. But I think we can all take a second and think of some things that probably happened to them. She had this huge building that was thriving, and she had to walk away from it because people didn't like a black woman owning and operating a business. She tried to open another public house further on East 5th, but the damage was done, and again, Civil War tension, it just didn't work out. And by 1869, the Thomas family had moved to Washington, D.C. Now, the good thing about this story is we know that they moved on because somebody wrote about it in the Coshocton Tribune. And they said that Letty Thomas was living her best life. She had moved to Washington, D.C. She was looking better and younger than ever. And not only that, but she was the matron of this new college known as Howard University. Her son went on to get a law degree from there, and Letty Thomas died. She lived there for the rest of her life, and she died in the company of her children and her grandchildren. So both of these stories are people that at different points in Coshocton thrived, but then as the tensions grew, they had to move out in order to survive. And I think that that's a really interesting tell of just how we have continued to just go up and down in Coshocton's history. Yeah. And so from here, after we get through the Civil War, post-Civil War, then we have the Dorseys, which Holli is going to talk about.
All this stuff to manage. So, the Dorsey family of Coshocton County. The story of the Dorsey family begins the way a lot of good stories begin. It was a dark and stormy night. On February 24th, 1866, 2 steamboats, the C.E. Hillman and the Nanny Byers collided on the Ohio River near Madison, Indiana at about 2 o'clock in the morning. The Nanny Byers was cut down and sank within about 4 minutes of the contact. She turned over. Her passengers were thrown into the water, the churning waters, and they were disoriented. They didn't know which way the shore was. Some were able to float on debris to safety, but a lot of people died that night. For days, the bodies washed up onto the shore, passengers and crew alike, and they were all solemnly attended to by the citizens in Madison. The Hillman, the one boat called the Hillman, was barely damaged, but at least 15 bodies attested to the horrible damage sustained by the Nanny Byers. On board the Hillman that night was crew member Clement Dorsey, age 26. Not long after this tragic accident, he left the steamboating profession. In September 1867, he went to Newark and worked at a barber shop and trained as a barber until December 1st, 1868, when he arrived in Coshocton. Whoops, I forgot to show you the picture of the Nanny Byers. Sorry, that's not actually our ship, but I couldn't find a picture of the actual ships involved, but just to capture that dark and stormy night. So Clement Dorsey moved to Coshocton in December of 1868, and he came here with about $48 to his name, and that equals about $1,086 and some change today. And he opened a barber shop on the corner of 4th and Main. And I was just realizing he arrived just before Letty left. These are some of the events that were happening in 1868. The main event was, it was just 3 years after the Civil War, so there was a lot of turmoil and upheaval still going on. On February 24th of that year, the impeachment of Andrew Johnson happened. He had been Vice President Johnson under Abraham Lincoln, and he assumed the office of president after Lincoln was assassinated. He was a Union man, but he had roots in the South. He said, "This is a country for white men, and as long as I am president, it shall be a government for white men." He believed that the Reconstruction Acts of 1867 were too harsh, and he repeatedly blocked their enforcement. When he ignored the Tenure of Office Act and dismissed his Secretary of War, Edward Stanton, without the Senate's approval, thank you for that laugh, okay? The House, angered by his open defiance, unanimously impeached him, but when it went to the Senate later that year, he escaped removal from office by just one vote. May 30th of that year, Memorial Day, is observed in the United States for the first time as a way of giving honor to the soldiers of the Civil War. They chose it to happen in May because that's when the flowers were blooming to decorate the graves with. July 28th, the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution is adopted, guaranteeing African Americans full citizenship and all persons in the United States due process of law. September of that year, Little Women by Louisa May Alcott is published. I just wanted to throw that in. It'll be evident later. November 3rd, Ulysses S. Grant was elected president. December 1st, Clement Dorsey arrives in Coshocton, Ohio. On December 25th, Clement Dorsey celebrated his 29th birthday. And also on December 25th, President Andrew Johnson granted unconditional pardon to all Civil War rebels without requiring them to take an oath of loyalty. This was known as the Christmas Amnesty. So that's a little bit about the world at that point. Soon after moving to Coshocton, Clement married the recently widowed Martha Johnson Lucas on October 14, 1869. Martha had one daughter, Dora, from her first marriage. She and Clement had 4 children who survived to adulthood: Effie, Isaac, Jesse, and Gertrude, and they lost 2 baby boys in infancy. And we need to pause and ask, were either of the Dorseys, Clement or Martha, ever enslaved? According to her obituary, Martha was born in 1840 in Warren County, North Carolina. But at age 2, her family moved to Coshocton. This is the 1850 census, which shows that she was living with her siblings and her father in Columbus. Her father is listed as a teamster. At this time, in Columbus, there were about 6 African American settlements populated by people who had escaped bondage in the South. Those settlements grew and multiplied over time, but at that point, there were about 6 of them. So it's likely that Martha and her family would have lived in one of these neighborhoods. But we don't know the whole story by any means. Clement's background is a little more difficult to figure out. From what I found on Ancestry, I can say for sure that his father, Clem Dorsey, was definitely enslaved. But some of the details contradict each other and the dates contradict each other, and it just shows me how hard it is to pin down African American genealogy. Where is Henry Louis Gates when you need him? They say if you could have dinner with a famous person, he is one of the famous people I would love to have dinner with, because I have some questions for him about Henry Howard. And what I could find about Clement himself on Ancestry was also somewhat conflicted. So I can't say for sure what his situation was. But we do have, from Hill's History of Coshocton County, a biographical record of his life that was included in this history book. And I'm thinking for him to be included in the history book, this was the only people included in the history book were really important people in Coshocton's history. So we can see how important he was, just the fact that he's in the book. And in his entry it says, Clement was born in Washington County, Maryland. Ancestry says a different county, but we know for sure he was born in Maryland. And he worked on a farm and canal boating there until 24 years of age, when he came to Parkersburg, West Virginia, with I. Cuthbertson, a government agent. So, worked on a farm. Could that mean he was enslaved on a farm? And who is this government agent, and why were they traveling together? Why did he bring him to Parkersburg? I don't know for sure, but it's possible. One answer could be that Cuthbertson was an agent with the Freedmen's Bureau. And one of the things that the Freedmen's Bureau did is it helped establish formerly enslaved people in their transition to freedom. It would help relocate them and help them find jobs. So it's possible that that's what happened with Clement. They would even sometimes provide transportation to areas with labor shortages. So it was from there that he did the boat thing, and then we go on and on. We're covering all of this this evening, and I just wanted to point out here that Mr. Dorsey was the first African American juror of this county, and he was also the first African American citizen to be nominated for a county office. Okay, now we're going to look at a few things that we found in the newspaper. And because from here we're just sort of piecing together what their life was like from what we find in the newspaper. And this was from 1875. I've got that a little bit out of order, but this is where it mentions that he was the first black juryman in the county. And just realizing 1875, is that what it says?
Yes.
Yeah. So he only came here, so he had been here less than 10 years. He already established himself with a good reputation. Even though Clement was the barber in the family, Martha was also involved in the hair care business. On the left are a list of prizes given in the Coshocton County Fair in 1873. And Martha won a prize for hair curls and hair switches. And then in 1874, there was a notice in the paper, "To the ladies, Mrs. M. Dorsey is now prepared to do all kinds of hair work at short notice and in the latest styles, also manufacture all kinds of hair jewelry. Good prices paid for cut hair." So hair switches, I had to look into that just briefly here. It was just hair pieces because the ladies wore their hair in such fancy updos. They didn't have enough hair to accomplish all of that. And poor women would sell their hair to be made into these hair switches, which were like the ponytails. And that's why I included the reference to Louisa May Alcott's Little Women. If you remember, Jo March got her hair cut off and sold it. Clement Dorsey received a patent for advertising fly paper. And when I say advertising fly paper, I mean fly paper that had room on it for advertising. Because he was from Coshocton, the advertising capital of the world, right? And he got this patent in 1891. And down at the bottom, we also have his signature there. A fire broke out in his barber shop. And the year on this one, who can see that? 1893. His barbershop caught fire. The interior was damaged. The outside of the building was okay, thanks to the hose companies. And then, so in 1894, he is selling Bible reference books door to door. And this is a notice that was in the paper. And it says, no home library can be complete without it. So he was quite an entrepreneurial fella. And maybe he was selling these books because his barbershop had been damaged. We're not quite sure about that. But we do have this photo, and this is Letty Smith's building. Letty Thomas, I'm sorry. And standing on the street beside, do you see a gentleman standing there wearing a vest? That's Clement Dorsey. And this is in the 500 block of Main Street, rather than his first shop was in the 400 block. But this is the city directory from 1895. I got this from the library. It's the oldest city directory they have. And it lists the address of the barbershop in it's a 500 number. And it also lists a man named Robert as the barber. And I'm pretty sure that was his brother. So the barbershop was still in the family. It had moved locations. And we also have the address of their home, 538 East Locust Street. And the house was built in 1865. And the house is still there. So we're just patching together their trail here through Coshocton. Now, while Clement was involved in his entrepreneurial and community pursuits, Martha made her own mark on the religious life of Coshocton. According to the Encyclopedia of Seventh-day Adventists, Martha Dorsey united with the Adventist Church in Columbus, Ohio, and was baptized by E.H. Gates, pictured here in the, you can read the caption there, in 1886. At that time, the Adventist Church no Adventist church existed in Coshocton. Martha Dorsey, her daughters, and one other woman were the only Seventh-day Adventists in the entire county. So that is in the online Seventh-day Adventist Encyclopedia. Martha Dorsey is talked about. And then in 1889, daughter Jessie wrote a letter to the youth instructor, which was an Adventist publication for young people. 15-year-old Jessie wrote, "We have a Sabbath school of 4 members. Mama is superintendent, I am secretary, Gertie is treasurer, and Effie pianist, as we have no organ. We are the only Adventists in the county." So it was Martha and her girls. And just as a historical note, in 1890, the Seventh-day Adventist Church voted for a policy of racial segregation that lasted for the next 75 years. And I'm still looking into this, and I'll be talking about it more in a future program. But for the time being, we have this from the Adventist Encyclopedia. After many appeals from Martha Dorsey, 2 ministers held a tent effort in Coshocton, arousing an interest there around 1893. So this is after they voted on the segregation. The interest in 1893, after similar efforts by others and a camp meeting held there strengthened the interest, a church was organized in Coshocton. So yay for Martha for being persistent. By the time of the 1900 census, Clement and Martha were living in Newark. And they had children, they had grown children living in Newark, so they probably moved there to be with their children. And they both died in Newark. We've got, this was on the front page of the Coshocton Morning Tribune, April 12, 1917. Clement Dorsey, age 77, colored, died at the home of his daughter at Newark, Tuesday evening. Dorsey formerly resided in the city. He leaves a widow and 3 children. And then Martha passed away June 29th, 1926. I really enjoyed following the breadcrumbs left by Clement and Martha Dorsey and discovering the life they led and the life they contributed to this community. Their legacy reaches even further, however, and on August 7th, we're going to do another program focusing on two of their daughters, the Dorsey sisters of Coshocton, Ohio. Jessie, on the left, I'm just going to give you a little teaser here. Jessie was a nurse and an educator and went to South Carolina and helped found a school that later became Voorhees University. And Gertrude was a gifted writer whose short stories have been included in some pretty prestigious anthologies. They have a ton to teach us, and I'm so excited about this program, and I hope you will join us.
Okay, we are on to the final segment of our program, and I'm going to be talking about basically the last century and the lives of Vivian Williams Saunders and Lula Sheffield Williams. So I'm going to ask you to come with me to the year 1924. It's the roaring 20s. The American economy is booming. More and more Americans have this newfangled gadget called a radio in their homes, their own personal sources of entertainment and news. And maybe on a Friday night you go out, you see a silent film, they're all the rage. And there's this new game called Bingo that everyone's playing. It just came out that year. And about 1 in 5 American households owns an automobile. But this is also a time of rampant racial discrimination and social upheaval. This is the year Congress passes the Johnson-Reed Act, which drastically limits immigration to the U.S. It establishes immigration quotas for each country, favoring immigrants from Northern and Western Europe and completely banning immigration from Asia. And I just want to point out these two examples. The example on the left is a photograph of Irish immigrants, and the caption says, "At our gates, this attractive group consists of Irish immigrants who arrived yesterday on the SS Republic. They were taken to Ellis Island. Picture indicates the Emerald Isle still produces sturdy men and pretty girls." So, favoring the Irish. Meanwhile, across the U.S., on the other side of the country, we have an immigrant named Vaishno Das Bagai. He is a Sikh immigrant from India who came to San Francisco in the early 20th century, and he became a naturalized citizen in 1923, but by court order it was revoked, and his family lost their home and business. Also, across the country, we have Jim Crow laws in the South. We have tense racial relations in the North. And in the decade leading up to 1924, 521 Black Americans are lynched. If you are Black in America in 1924, and you happen to be living in a northern city like Harlem, you might get to enjoy a boom in Black artistic expression, a time of literature and jazz and art known as the Harlem Renaissance. And you might even be part of a small but growing Black middle class. But more likely, you are one of the millions of Black Americans who are starting over after fleeing segregation and racial terror in the South. And if you've landed in the state of Ohio, unfortunately, you have found discrimination and racism alive and well. Across the United States, the Ku Klux Klan has 4 million members. 10% of them live in Ohio. Just 1 year prior, the largest Klan gathering in Ohio history, one attended by 75,000 members, happened at Buckeye Lake, one county over. Enter the Sheffield family. Several years prior, Reverend Samuel Walton Sheffield met an evangelist named Matilda Tilly Mae Smiley Graham, a widow with 5 children and a passion for music. It was love at first sight, a whirlwind romance, and they were married within 2 weeks. They tried to make a life in West Virginia, where Sam was from, but the coal dust made Tilly Mae sick. So in 1924, they moved to Coshocton, where Tilly Mae had a brother, and they began their life here. Now, it was not easy to find a job as a black man, especially one who was new to town. But Sam Sheffield had a growing family to support, so he took the only job he could find, washing dishes in a restaurant owned by another member of Coshocton's black community. And later, he found a job as a truck driver, and Tilly earned money cleaning houses. And this picture on the right comes from Rick Sheffield's book, and apparently they also both worked at the Coshocton Country Club, because they're in the parlor of the country club there. So today I want to give the much abridged story of 2 daughters of this family, incredible women, only 2 generations removed from slavery, who went on to impact this community in different but powerful ways. Much of what I'm going to share to you today comes from an oral history that I collected from Lula in 2022. And you're going to get to hear a couple of clips from that oral history. Now, Vivian was 11 or 12 years old when she moved to Coshocton with her mother, Tilly Mae, and her stepfather, Sam. And Lula, the first of the 6 children that Sam and Tilly Mae had together, was only 3 years old. So the family lived on North 6th Street, close enough for the kids to walk to the library, which was in the old Carnegie building. And they attended Chestnut Street School and later Central High School, which, unlike many of the schools in Ohio cities, were integrated. But the children were not allowed to participate in school clubs because they were black. They were not allowed to play on white sports teams. And so Vivian, Lula, and their siblings had to make their own fun. And they did have fun. The Sheffield house was always filled with music. And sometimes the family would play a game, what they called hash songs. So Tilly would play the piano, and the kids would all pick a song, whatever song they wanted, and they just sing their song all at the same time. So different songs happening at the same time. And then the piano would stop, and everyone would stop singing, and Mary Louise, who apparently had a beautiful voice, would take over and sing a solo. The kids would also put on music shows for the neighborhood children and charge them a penny to attend. Entrepreneurial spirits. But there were also days when the Sheffields would tell their children to get inside and lock the doors. On those days, the KKK would march through Coshocton after sundown, and for Vivian and Lula and the whole Sheffield family, there was nothing to do but wait and fear for morning to come. Vivian and Lula both came of age during the Great Depression, and yet their lives were rich in love and culture. And I want to show these 2 pictures of the Phyllis Wheatley Club. Now, a bit of background. Phyllis Wheatley was an enslaved and later emancipated woman who is believed to be the first African-American author to publish a book of poetry. And the Phyllis Wheatley Club was a social group for black women arranged by the YWCA. And in the first picture, which I don't have a date, I'm guessing it's sometime in the 1940s, we see Tilly Mae, mom, in the second row. She's circled in red. And in front, Lula and her sisters, Mildred and Geneva. And in the second picture, oh gosh, I think I forgot to correct this. I know that the second in blue is Vivian, and Lula's on the far right. wearing an amazing outfit. I want that polka dot dress and choker. And in the middle, I have the wrong person circled. So slightly to the right, I think is the sister Mildred. And then the person I have circled, I believe, was her one of her brother's wives. So in 1941, Lula married Charles Chappie Williams, who was a professional boxer who went on to fight in the D-Day invasion of Normandy during World War II. And Vivian and Lula's brothers also fought in the war. This is a picture of Tilly Mae with her sons Maurice, William, and Sam Jr. Vivian pursued the artistic talent she'd inherited from her father and improved her craft under the instruction of local artists Laura Patterson, Stella Hall, Thomas Gartside, and Ray Eaton. And although she painted in several mediums, her favorite was watercolor. In 1950, she started spending her summers attending art classes at Ohio University. Now, the civil rights era brought changes to America and to Coshocton. And what I would like to do is to let you hear from Lula herself what that change looked like. So I'm going to play a couple of clips from the oral history that I took with her.
We entertained ourselves. We didn't have to have some place to go, but we couldn't go anywhere anyway, not only because of the money, but because of the prejudice. There were just so many places we could go. In fact, we couldn't even go swimming in Lake Park because it just wasn't allowed. Blacks could not go in there. And until, I don't know what year it was, but anyway, it was during, I'd say probably during the 60s when there was so much. Anyway, a group from the Presbyterian Church tried to get some blacks to go to one of the parks out in the country, out up off around County Road 10 or somewhere in that area. Which one was that? Forest Hills. That's what it was. But anyway, they got a group to go, and my brother was one of them, and they broke the bars there. And I was on the city recreation board when my children were small. And, of course, they always get swimming lessons at Lake Park. Well, the man who was the director of the city recreation told me that my children were welcome to ride on the bus to the park, but they couldn't go in. They'd have to go over there and sit and watch. I said, no. I'm not sitting right over there to sit and watch the other children swim. Are you crazy? But they didn't get anywhere for that for a long time. In fact, I'm not sure how this came about, but I do know that Tom Leach had a hand in it because we were bowling one night at the Presbyterian Bowling League was meeting, and Tom's wife was a member of that bowling group, and he worked a lot of nights. So while we were there bowling, she went down to his office and talked to him. And when she came back, it was full explosion on this recreation business. So she said, Tom says that they cannot stop anybody. It's a city park, and they cannot stop anyone from going in there. And that's what broke the barrier there. When I was working, the only job, well, not just me, but about the only jobs that we could get were domestics. Now, some of the men worked in factories, not very many of them. There were one or two at Clouds. In fact, my husband worked at Clouds when he first came home from the war, and they had black and white restrooms. And he said the black one was just filthy. And he said, I'm not going in there to take a shower and change my clothes, that filthy place. So he started going in the white ones. And of course, that caused a big mess, but it changed. I said, no, I'm not coming in here in my clean clothes and then I get dirty and have to go out in those dirty clothes. No, I'm not doing it. Well, the General Electric plant made a big difference in we entered. Well, the General Electric plant made a big difference in racial relations here in Coshocton because they're the ones who opened up most of the jobs. Because their personnel man was the black man when they came here. The people who came here with GE, they belonged to all different churches, Presbyterian, Grace Methodist, Baptist. Anyway, they all got together and decided they were going to make some changes. And we had groups who met in different homes once or twice a month to discuss all these problems, why we had these problems, and what can we do about it. That's what we talked. It was rough sometimes, but it was things that need to be said. Because one thing is, well, what do you people want? What do you mean, you people? We want to have a decent life just like you do. Because before that, we hadn't had anything like that. They weren't all GE, but people from the churches where they belonged joined in. We had several groups. You could get in any group you wanted to. Mostly not more than 10, 12 people would meet in someone's home, and you could jump around. I mean, you didn't have to stay with that particular group if you thought you were missing something, because everybody wanted to be in our group. My husband was very outspoken, and everybody wanted to be in Chappie's group. But they did a lot of good here in Coshocton. I went to the Edmont one time to talk to, I forget the man's name who was HR at the time. Anyway, he said, well, it would be hard for us to hire a black person. No, he didn't say black out there. He said colored. Anyway, it would be hard because the other men would quit. So now you're going to sit there and tell me that a man's got a family to take care of and he's going to quit his job just because there's a black man beside him? Well, and he didn't do anything. He didn't make any moves at all. But shortly after that, I don't know if he retired. He might have died, I don't know. But Bob Hopkins, whose father was a doctor here, he became the personnel man at Edmonds, and he started hiring. But then I still think it's that GE influence.
So, at this time of radical change in our country and in our town, both Vivian and Lula made their marks on this place. In 1959, Vivian opened an art studio on St. John Street, where she taught private classes and lessons. On the wall of the studio, she displayed one of her favorite paintings, Norman Rockwell's iconic "The Problem We All Live With," a painting of 6-year-old Ruby Bridges being escorted by federal marshals into an all-white elementary school at the beginning of the era of desegregation. One local resident, Nancy Mahon, I don't know if I'm saying that right. What is it? Mahan, thank you. Recalled the impact that Vivian had on her understanding of what it was like to be a black woman in this country and this town. Nancy wrote to me, "Vivian opened my eyes to the fact that discrimination and related painful memories existed, something I had never thought about before. She did not openly talk about it unless an appropriate opportunity came up. If someone asked, she told them the honest truth she had lived. When I was older, she asked me to think about things I had never considered before. I learned so much more from her than just how to paint a watercolor." When the weather was nice, Vivian would sometimes take her students to the court square to sketch. She also worked for decades as an art teacher in the public schools. I think maybe also at Sacred Heart, someone mentioned that. By 1970, she had trained more than 2,000 students. Some of those students won college scholarships for their art. Some became art teachers themselves. And she was also a co-founder of the Roscoe Art Guild, and in 1973, the Coshocton Business and Professional Women's Club named her Woman of the Year. That same year, 1973, the Coshocton County Commissioners selected Williams to restore the Arthur William Woofle mural in the county courthouse. And that mural had originally been painted in 1908, but had been damaged by a leak in the clock tower. Over the course of her storied career as an artist, her landscapes and still life paintings won numerous awards, were displayed in galleries from New York to Los Angeles, and became part of Clark Atlanta University's permanent collection. Vivian took pride in showing the world that women could paint and believed that being an artist required her to feel God in all things. Meanwhile, Lula immersed herself in and made many contributions to Coshocton's civic life. She was the president of the parent-teacher organization when her children were in school. She joined the city recreation board. She served as president of the YWCA board and the Coshocton chapter of the NAACP. She was on the Red Cross board, and she'd drive people who needed cancer treatments in other cities to their appointments. She was on the March of Dimes board. In fact, part of the very first chapter of that organization after a couple from Coshocton met Franklin Roosevelt at Warm Springs and decided to start the March of Dimes. She volunteered at Roscoe Village and the Senior Center and was an active member of the Presbyterian Church. Everyone knew Lula because Lula was everywhere. When Vivian died in 1998 and when Lula died last year, they both left holes in the fabric of our community. But they aren't gone because they left behind lots of beautiful art and children and their legacies and their stories. So if you live here in Coshocton County, I encourage you to hang on to their stories and the other stories that you heard tonight. Tell them to your friends and your family, to your kids and your grandkids. Preserve them, cherish them, and be inspired by them to leave this place better than you found it. The same way that Pryor Foster, Letty Thomas, the Dorsey family, Vivian Williams Saunders, and Lula Sheffield Williams did. So in just a second, we're going to have a Q&A, and we'll do our best to answer questions you have, though I suspect maybe some of you in the audience might be better able to answer some of them. But I want to thank a few people before we do that. One, I want to recognize that 2 of Lula's children made the journey from Columbus area to be here, so Mike and Linda, thank you so much.
First of all, of course, I'm thankful that you all are here.
Can you speak into the mic so we can get it recorded?
I was a cheerleader. I thought I was loud enough. What to do?
Just, yeah.
Okay. I'm sorry to interrupt the program, but I'm Lula's youngest, and my brother is here with me as well. What struck me, I enjoyed the whole program. Some of the earlier stories I knew nothing about, not about my mother or my aunt. I knew everything about them. But what affected me the most in a positive way is that my mother died on October 10th of last year. I had not heard her voice since before October the 10th of last year. And it was so refreshing and wonderful to hear my mother speak, because it just reminded me of all the wonderful times that we shared as a family. So thank you I enjoyed hearing her voice. Her birthday, by the way, is Friday.
Thank you, Linda. And I will say another person I want to thank is my student, Dana Malik. We would not have that recording available if it weren't for Dana. I recorded it, but it needed some help. It needed some editing. And so Dana transcribed that whole interview, and she did sound editing, and she took out these thematic clips. And all of those things are now available to you. We worked with the library and the state library and the Ohio Memory. They're all available online, and these were on the chairs, but I've got a few extra. I've got a QR code you can scan to access the full oral history and some of those thematic clips and the transcript, which I hope you will do and hear more of Lula's wonderful voice and incredible stories, which that was just a small teaser for what's available. I also want to thank the many people who contributed photos, newspaper clippings, and memories included in this presentation, including Nancy Mahan, Lana Cushman, Annette Forsyth Sauron via her daughter Michelle, and the many folks who post in the Facebook group Coshocton County History and Memories. There's another handout on your chair that talks about some upcoming events that are sort of part of this series the museum is doing. I feel very privileged to be part of, I guess, this is kicking it off. But Holli will be speaking again in August 7th about the Dorsey sisters. Rick Sheffield, nephew of Lula and Vivian, is going to be coming in September, and it sounds like Abby's also going to be talking more about Prior Foster in a future date. So please, we hope to see you there. I'll now open it up for questions. Yes.
I talked to Lulu a long time ago. I think she was awarded the Coshoctonian Award. Might have been 30 years ago or something, but if I recall, it seems like Vivian, or somehow they moved up here from Louisville, Kentucky. Know anything about that?
So Lula's mother, I think, had come from Louisville. Is that correct?
Lula's grandparents were from Louisville.
Mm-hmm.
And so her mother was from Louisville. And that's kind of, that's
Yes.
how the Louisville.
Yes.
Notice I said Louisville.
Louisville. See, yeah, we're not saying it right. And in fact, her grandmother had been enslaved in Kentucky, and she had stories. That's mentioned in the oral history, so you can hear a little bit more about that experience. But Lula herself was born in Youngstown, Ohio, and then moved here at age 3. So she spent 100 of her 103 years in Coshocton.
I'm from Louisville.
Okay.
If I recall correctly, their family grew up in what I consider a black middle-class neighborhood. I grew up in a poor white neighborhood. But we would get in the car and go down to this church, and I'm pretty sure that's where the family went to church on Sunday night. It was hot, and they had the church windows open, they could sing. And we'd take lawn chairs and sit on the sidewalk and listen to them sing.
Mm-hmm.
And they, like the building was rock and rolling. We wouldn't dare go inside, but they grew up in a nice neighborhood.
The name of that church is Hill Street Baptist Church. It was originally in Cabbage Patch in Louisville, Kentucky. And the church burned, and we recently attended a service of Lula's grandfather started that church 135 years ago. And so and it's still thriving. And they honored Lula's grandfather in that service, and my brother and I attended that as well.
Incredible. And the music is a big theme within this family, and everybody was musical. And so, in fact, I think she said her uncles had performed, they were part of a group that performed for the Queen of England when she visited America. It's pretty incredible. Other questions? Yes?
I was under the impression that they were sister-in-laws. Were they sister-in-laws or sisters?
They're half-sisters.
Well, okay, they never use that term. Half sisters, they have the same mother but different fathers. Tilly, who was known as Tilly, not many people called her Tilly Mae, but Tilly was married to Mr. Graham, and she and Mr. Graham had 5 children. Vivian was one of those 5. Mr. Graham died, and then she met Sam Sheffield and had 6 more children, and Lula was the first of that group. But they all grew up together, and
They were sisters.
They were sisters. We never used the term step. Yeah, they were sisters.
And the last names, I realize it's confusing because they both have Williams, but
Yes,
that was just,
right.
that was a coincidence that,
They both married men with the last name of Williams, but neither of the Williams men were related.
other questions? Yes.
This is just a question more for the older stories. It almost sounds like there's a trend as sort of Ohio and this region, Coshocton transformed from wilderness to civilization, that you saw people being pushed, like these black communities being pushed out, business owners being pushed out of their places. Like, do you think that was a thing? Like when it was a wilder place, there was more equality?
I think that among local citizens, there was much more equality. I think that politicians are going to do what politicians do. A lot of the politicians in Ohio at that time didn't have slaves in Ohio, but they had them on a plantation somewhere that they benefited from. But local organization or local community, so long as there was an abundance of resources, they were shared freely. I think as we started running out of those resources, people tend to find a reason to take it from other people. And, you know, the discussion around slavery, I mean, it caused a civil war. And so we see that discussion being used politically to favor, you know, politicians, or to favor taking resources away. But those laws were put in place because people weren't following them. So, you know, you see a little bit of both happening. And that's not to say that everybody in the state of Ohio is a saint who believed that slavery was wrong. It's not the case at all. But what we can tell from Coshocton in the early days is there was more respect that was given based off of how people work together.
I'll add a little to that, and then I'll hand to you, Holly. I think it's also worth noting that many of the first white settlers in this region, they came on land grants for their service in the Revolutionary War, and many came from Virginia and Maryland. So they had people there, and as the tensions ramped up for the Civil War, I wonder how that contributed. I mean, I can't know for sure, but I think it really had something to do with it. I also think it's worth noting that, you know, this was not an empty wilderness before they came here. There were Native American inhabitants who had lived in this area for thousands of years, and were forced out prior to those land grants being given. And so, yeah.
You're talking to my phone instead of this. I can recommend a good book. The Bone and the Sinew of the Land, America's Forgotten Black Pioneers in the Struggle for Equality. It's written by Annalisa Cox. I heard her do a talk. When I first started working here, Jen and I listened to her do a talk, and it was so interesting. It was about the Northwest Territory and the forming of that, and how good it was. It was a really good situation for black people in this area. And then, like you were saying, Yael, it's like the more white people who came, the more those folks got pushed out. But the author follows a particular family. I think they were more in the Indiana area, but it's a really good book. In fact, I just put it on hold the other day to reread it. So,
Other questions? Yeah, Mike.
Question, well, actually a comment and question. There's a man, I think a lot about work history and who was able to do what and that sort of thing as a Coshoctonian. There was a man who worked in advertising, and Coshocton being this advertising mecca, named George Watkins, whose wife, I'm not sure which, I think she may have been a hairdresser, I'm not sure. A very prominent role. He was a professional in the advertising world as an illustrator, something like that. And we only knew him from a distance, but these stories, these people like that just kind of pop up out of nowhere. And it's kind of evidence of that, the strange kind of Jim Crow thing. You never can quite make sense of it, what you think you're seeing, and then these other things right beside it that exist. They coexist in this strange kind of irony. And there was a veterinarian when we grew up who's associated with the OSU Extension Center. So to have somebody like that, these people interfacing with us, they were close to our parents, that kind of thing. It was just a strange kind of dichotomy.
Right, and was George Watkins, he was black?
Yes.
Illustrator? Okay, yeah, I think, yeah, we'll have to add that to our research, because we'll look him up, yeah. I mean,
American Artworks?
okay. Yeah, that's excellent. I mean, I think you're making also an important point, which is that, you know, as we saw people like Letty Thomas and Pryor Foster and others, you know, pushed out of this area as it became untenable to live here, we lose their knowledge and their, you know, and so we have these gaps in history, and we have to piece it together from the little fragments that we can still find. But I think this is one of the consequences of, you know, forced migration, racism, segregation policies, and whatnot, is that these histories are much harder to access than, say, if your family had been living here since the early 1800s and those stories had been, and archives had been preserved within your family for all that time. Yes?
Years ago, I always thought it was great as a kid because my dad worked at the Ohio Power, and Lula was one of the secretaries there, a receptionist, and she always stood out, not because of her color necessarily, because she was always so well dressed and well spoken. And I loved going, even after my father was deceased, my mother and I would go to the retirees reunion, and I always wanted to sit by her because she was more interesting to talk to. And one other thing I wanted to say, you're all aware, and maybe I'm wrong, I always thought, and I never talked to Vivian about this, that she converted to Catholicism. Yeah. And that was always an interesting thing to me.
She went to the Presbyterian Church.
Lula went to the Presbyterian Church. Yeah,
Yes.
you can answer that.
Well, I'm just saying, Vivian became a Catholic. I don't know at what point. I always thought of her as, you know, a member of the Catholic Church. And my mother, Lula, was a member of the Presbyterian Church. So when I was younger, we were Baptists because Lula's father was a Baptist preacher, and so we grew up as Baptists. But then as they went on with their adult lives, then they made other choices.
And you had an interesting fact about the Presbyterian Church. I don't know if you want to share that.
Yeah, I didn't put it in my slides, but as I was researching Letty and Pryor Foster, I found that the Presbyterian Church in Coshocton was extremely accepting of Black people very early on. There is from the early 1820s, it might be 1830s, but there's a receipt for people donating money for lamps and lamp oil for the First Presbyterian Church, and both Letty Thomas and Pryor Foster are noted as donating money for that. The early days Presbyterian records, you can find it online and probably at our Presbyterian Church, specific to Coshocton, note that the Sunday school in Coshocton's Presbyterian Church's early days, they taught Black children. They had them separate, they were segregated, but they were still taught and went to the Presbyterian Church on Sunday. And then you see Reverend William Hunt, speaking favorably, his recollections speak favorably of the Black people in the community. He also wrote an extensive newspaper article about Letty Thomas and her contributions that, really highlight her time in Coshocton in a way that other things do not. And so I think that really speaks. I can't speak to the other churches. I don't know much about them, but I think that that's noteworthy that they continued to progress with history.
Yes, one more question and then we'll. Okay.
I grew up in a Presbyterian church, still a member there. Miss Lula was always one of my favorite people. It's like she never aged. The whole time I was growing up, she always had on a fabulous hat every Sunday. But to attest to what you were saying, growing up, the church always accepted anyone who stepped foot in the door. Nobody thought twice, and it's still that way.
It's a lovely note to end on and something for us to all aspire to, I think. So thank you all for coming tonight. We're happy to stick around if you have other questions. We're going to turn up the lights. Feel free to look at the beautiful quilts, and we hope to see you again in August for Holli's talk on the Dorseys.